Hello and welcome to the CUFI Weekly. I'm your host, Kasim. Hello and welcome to another episode of the CUFI Weekly. We are in the Golan Heights today, right on the Israeli border with Syria. So to get more of an insight into where we are and why this region is so strategically important for Israel, we're going to be speaking to our good friend Ron. So join us as we find out more about where we are and why it's so important. So Ron, where are we standing right now?
Kasim, we are basically standing in a deserted military position on the eastern border of the Golan Heights. We are right between the Israeli Golan and the Syrian section of the Golan, in the Quneitra Valley, basically, as we're talking about.
So we're basically overlooking Syria right now. I'm guessing that must cause some strategic issues being this close to a hostile state.
You're absolutely right. We've all known the 6-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, but since we had the ceasefire in '74, it was very quiet, and as you can see, we farm and everything is great, and we have civilian life here, and kibbutzim and moshavim and even cities. But in 2011, everything changed. We're talking about the Syrian civil war, and after that, with the demise of Al-Qaeda and ISIS in the region, we still have to understand that Syria still is a hostile entity, but for civilian life here, of course, it complicates the situation. We're standing in a deserted bunker. This is a military position. It's not being used right now, but we had those just in case if we'd have to deploy into them.
So Ron, tell us a little bit about where we are now and what we're essentially looking at here.
Okay. Basically, we're now standing in the old Syrian military headquarters. This building specifically was built by Russia to be used as a kind of a hospital or military headquarters for the Syrians. And you have to remember that until 1967, the Golan Heights is part of Syria. You can see that gray line, that steel barricade is actually the armistice line, the border of Israel and Syria, if you will. And a hill next to it, you see that's actually an Israeli position in terms of cameras. This is just spitting distance from each other. And of course, then the ruins of the old city of Quneitra, right close to it. I can tell you from experience that years ago when we had the local civil war, we had extremist Islamist organizations waving at us from the rooftops on this point. Now we have more of Syrian military presence in this area. Syria never rebuilt this village, instead they built new Quneitra, and this is just to show you how close things are here in terms of the border.
Israel and Syria haven't fought a direct conflict for decades, but this border still remains very hot and there are multiple security threats to Israel from this border. Could you go into that a little bit and explain to our viewers what Israel is facing on this border and in this region directly?
With the package that we have in Syria, we have a regime that is not favorite of us. Israel did treat the wounded, and we treated people coming for medical asylum or in the Syrian civil war just not far from us. But we have to remember that just a while ago, we had ISIS, Al-Qaeda at the border. Now we have Hezbollah. Hezbollah, an internationally recognized terror organization sitting not far here from Syria. We have Irani support militia groups just not far from us. We have the Syrian military, who's not our best fan. And with everything that comes to conclusion, you also have to remember that the Syrian army is both working with Iran and also sometimes working with Russian facilitation.
So Ron, we're a few miles from the Syrian border, and what really stands out to me is, unlike, for example, the DMZ between the Koreas, like there is life happening a few miles away from the border. You've got a park right here. So what are the implications for civilians living this close to the border, and why do they choose to live here?
So when the state was established, Ben-Gurion actually sent people to live by the borders because he said where the lights of the towns, the moshavim and kibbutzim, are going to be, that's the border of Israel. And how does it affect life? An example is that every community who lives in an area that is close to a hostile or dangerous section, whether if it's the West Bank, the Golan Heights and the border of Syria, the border of Lebanon, or the Gaza Strip, communities have like a first response team of the civilians. But even with all the threats and the things that we were afraid of, the offshoots in the Syrian civil war, or what's been stirring and cooking on the Syrian side as we speak, life goes on. And people live here because we have a small country, we have to use it, and this is part of why we're here.
Okay guys, so I really wanted to just show you something very quickly. So if you can see the park behind me, it's just a few steps from where I'm standing. And if you take maybe just 10 steps over, for me at least, you have a shelter. And I just want to illustrate to you how this is the norm. because of the threat of rockets and missiles, that you have playgrounds where children are playing, and a few feet away you have a bomb shelter, because that is the proximity and that is the threat that Israelis are facing every single day. And it's really important that we understand this, because there is no parallel for us living in the United States. But this is the everyday for so many Israeli communities, yet they're not only surviving, they're thriving and building an incredible country and an incredible society. So thank you for joining us on another episode of the CUFI Weekly. We've had an amazing time here in the Golan and really seeing the paradox of being on the border with Syria, seeing what was the old Syrian army headquarters, and being here and seeing life thriving in Israel. But we should always remember the threat is always present, be it from Iran, Iran's proxies, Syria. That is something that is a reality for so many Israelis. So we must remember that, so when we see these biased newspaper articles or news reports which are essentially painting Israel as the aggressor, we know the truth. And that is so important for us at CUFI, to share the truth, to educate and empower each one of you to speak in truth. So until next time, this is Kasim for the CUFI Weekly. For Zion's sake, do not remain silent. Be sure to subscribe and share this with your friends. Thanks for checking out today's episode of CUFI Weekly. If you enjoyed this episode and want to stay up to date with the latest news from the Middle East along with topics involving US-Israel relations, please be sure to like and subscribe. And remember to click that notification button so that you are notified every time a new show is uploaded.